This is a paper that's now published in this book, Neurocognitive Foundations of Mind. This is a neuroecological architecture situated cognizing systems. This is Luis Favela, who we've talked about before in Cognition Futures and some other contexts. Let me go over the abstract and then we'll go into the paper. Um, so this is this is a chapter in this book, and so the abstract reads: situated approaches to cognizing, which is defined as distributed, embodied, and extended cognition, or different ways of doing cognition, basically, have exerted an immense influence on the cognitive and psychological sciences. So distributed cognition is often thought of as different agents doing cognition and then kind of coming together in groups. Embodied cognition, of course, is doing cognition with reference to a body. So the brain or the agent is in a body, and that body conditions how that cognition is expressed. And then extended cognition is extending cognition into the world through artifacts or through the environment. So this is, these are things, of course, that are situated in a context that are hard to separate from their context. So, again, when we talk about experimental replicability, if we want to make an experiment like this replicable, we don't need to just replicate the sort of the highly contrived experimental conditions, but we need to put people in a similar environment. So this is the whole sort of debate between very controlled experiments in the lab and these more naturalistic experiments where it may not be as highly controlled, but you're in the right environment, in the right context, and so that's maybe what matters more. Since such accounts typically do not prioritize neurobiology, their impact is felt far less in neuroscience. So when we talk about extended and embodied and distributed cognition, usually we're not thinking about this in terms of neuroscience. We're thinking about this in terms of like behavior, and in cognitive science, it's usually like some behavioral observation where you put people in a airplane cockpit and you look at how they make choices on a control panel, and then you record their responses, and there's no neuroscience necessarily involved in it. So this is where we want to sort of unify ecological psychology with neuroscience and have this neuroecological architecture. The influence in ecological psychology, which stresses the role of ecological information, which is, of course, things like flowing visual cues and other types of dynamical systems type inputs, or things that lead to dynamical systems from the environment. We have this role of ecological information that dynamically unfolds at the scale of organism environment systems that's critical for cognizing, and this is something that is something we need. A substantial criticism of this approach concerns the apparent absence of the brain's contribution to cognition, insofar as other situated approaches remain influenced by ecological psychology. Such criticisms undermine other approaches as well. The primary aim of this work is to present a framework for integrating neuroscience with situated approaches, namely the neuroecological nexus theory, or NEXT. So this is the theory he's proposing here. To be successful, NEXT must both maintain the core principles of ecological psychology and provide testable hypotheses concerning the neurobiological contributions to intelligent organism environment events. The latter is provided by contemporary neuroscience work on the neural manifold hypothesis. In hypothesizing that situated cognition can be explained by interactions among environmental or ecological information and classes of neuronal manifolds, NEXT provides a step towards a more complete understanding of mind, one that spans the cognitive and psychological sciences as well as the neurosciences. So this is something that unifies two different areas. This is the preprint And so it gets into a little bit of history here. Situated approaches to cognition generally adhere to the view that intelligent systems are always embodied and embedded. So this is something that, again, when we talk about situated cognition, which is usually a sort of a shorthand for these sort of naturalistic experiments, or a theory that we use to interpret naturalistic experiments, we're usually dealing with intelligent systems. It could mean a human operator, or an animal in a naturalistic environment, or it could mean an AI system or an automated system in a body in a naturalistic environment or something like that. So it could be like a robot in a naturalistic environment, or an AI in a naturalistic environment, like an autonomous vehicle or something like that. And so we have to start thinking about these theoretical constructs like embodiment, embeddedness, example. Though there is variety and controversy in how the term is used, as a starting point, embodied refers to the idea that cognition requires a body to occur. So embodied means you need a body, whatever a body is. And so a body could be like, our bodies, where we have relations between the different parts of our bodies. It could be like a vehicle. So a vehicle has specific movements, it has specific control imperatives, and so that those, you have to operate within that context. So you have a vehicle that's, say, moving around an environment. It can get to different points by selecting different control mechanisms like steering or acceleration or reversals, and they create different behavioral outputs. And so these behavioral outputs then these different behavioral outputs sort of determine what the intelligent behavior looks like. So if you only have a subset of control imperatives available to you, it doesn't matter what your intelligent behavior is sort of deducing from the environment. The outputs are the important part. And so the outputs might limit significantly what you can actually express as a behavior. So this is embodiment, and this is, of course, important. Their whole conference is on embodiment in, say, like robots and automated systems. But it's easier said than done. There are a lot of open questions in embodiment and how to characterize that vis-a-vis these intelligent controllers. In a more specific sense, this means that there tends to not be a sharp distinction between cognition and non-cognition in the body. And related, the sensory motor processes are important for cognition. So we need to really we can't just think of the body as kind of a conduit for intelligence or for cognition. The body actually interacts with intelligence. So like you acquire information through your eyes or through your hands, and you don't require information, through your stomach. It's not the conduit. But there's an interaction there. So sometimes your visual acuity is controlled by your central nervous system, and there are connections between the body and mind that need to occur here. And this is true of any kind of a controller with any kind of body. So it could be like a autonomous vehicle controller. It has to have interactions with the vehicle. And in fact, we have that in autonomous vehicles with sensor systems across the vehicle. In a more specific sense, this means there tends not to be a sharp distinction between cognition and non-cognition. And related, the sensory motor processes are important for cognition. There is a spectrum in how weak or strong these positions are. At the weaker end of the spectrum, cognition is primarily a brain event, but the brain area is associated with the body's sensory motor processes, play important roles in causing and enabling even higher forms of cognition, such as abstract reasoning and language. At the stronger end of the spectrum, cognition is not primarily a brain event, with the body's non-neural structures and processes causing and constituting even those previously mentioned higher forms of cognition. So this is like where we talk about weak and strong embodiment. Weak embodiment is where we kind of think of the brain as being within a body, yes, but the brain is doing most of the work, and the body is just there as sort of an instrument of the brain. In strong embodiment, the body is actually doing most of the computation, or it's balancing out with the brain or the controller. So, this is like a debate within embodiment that's important here because, you have to deal with that, the role of the body, basically. So, this is where we think about embodiment, and it's important to kind of be very specific what we mean by embodiment. Okay, so, and then we have to go back, when we think about ecological psychology, we need to go back to behaviorism and think about sort of a route out of behaviorism. So when we kind of came from behaviorism and moved into the cognitive revolution, we were kind of left with some intellectual baggage. Some of that is where, even from the earliest days of psychology and behaviorism, there was some form of functionalism, which means that, like, the way we thought of all mental processes was primarily functional, meaning that something did something else. So when we think about these interactions between body and brain or body and controller, we're always thinking in terms of functionalism. So it's like, what is, or why does this behavior exist? It must exist for a reason. It's probably to adapt to its environment, to allow the organism to adapt to its environment. And so this is, of course, both good and bad in a lot of ways, because sometimes functionalism can constrain us, and sometimes it serves as a useful explanatory device. So this kind of found its way through behaviorism, and then it found its way sort of into the cognitive revolution as well. And so, but in behaviorism specifically, it had three main commitments. The first is that psychology is the science of behavior, and that the sources of behavior are basically external, which means that they're in the environment. And that when you talk about mental concepts, you shouldn't, and rather you should talk about behavioral concepts. And this actually is one of the differences between cognition, or the cognitive, what would become cognitive science, and ecological psychology, is that ecological psychology sort of retained this aspect of the source of behavior, which is that it's external in the environment instead of internal to the mind. And so this is kind of describing this distinction between weak and strong embodiment. And so then, we kind of talk a little bit about the cognitive revolution going through this history, and then, of course, the position of Gibsonian ecological psychology within that. And, of course, sort of Gibsonian ecological psychology bridges this gap between perception and action and sort of behavior, or some of the things we think about in cognition, and behaviorism and some of the features of behaviorism. And there have been a lot of applications of ecological psychology to development, to human-machine interaction, to virtual reality, and etc. And so then again, in ecological psychology, we think of perception as being direct, meaning that we're really kind of drawing from ecological information, and we're building our models based on that. The information is out in the environment and not necessarily originating in the brain or in the mind. And so, we have different ways of, dealing with perception. That's, where we treat perception as direct. It doesn't rely on any sort of intermediate representation. And then So, again, okay. Then second, perception and action are continuous. So again, this is where, in a lot of psychology experiments, we present these discrete trials and we repeat stimulus presentation over and over again. In an ecological setting, perception and action are actually continuous. They flow, and the order of those stimuli are very important in terms of acquiring that information. So you can't just present things in these discrete, discontinuous trials. They have to be in this order, in this continuous flow. And so this is actually quite a big challenge to a lot of experimental designs, because if we have, like, say, a naturalistic design, we might put an agent out into the environment and let them interact with the environment. We get this ecological information, this continuous information. We get this perception action loop that forms, but that action is quite unique to that set of interactions. So as you can see, this is very hard to square away with replication, because every time you run the experiment, the flow of information from the environment will be somewhat different. I mean, even if you have the same environment, a highly controlled environment, it will be somewhat different. But this is necessary to understand the true nature of a perception action loop. And it kind of speaks to how maybe, the way we think about doing experiments does not square away with the needs to understand how the mind works or how behavior works. And then third, we talk about affordances. And so as a consequence of perception being direct and the continuity of perception and action, it follows that detected ecological information can specify meaningful opportunities for action, namely affordances. In short, affordances are perceivable opportunities for behavior. So they're just features within an environment, or somewhere where you kind of latch onto them. So they're kind of like intuitive points where you can kind of pick up. So if you have, like, say, for example, a door, if you see a handle to the door, you learn that that handle is good for either pushing or pulling the door on a hinge. So you learn this in development. You interact with the door. And once you interact with the door, you get an intuition for how it operates. And so any door that you encounter, you try to push or pull it in with the handle. Now, if a door maybe slides along the track and you try to do that, then you have problems generalizing. But if a door always behaves the same way, then you just simply use that intuition to guide the action, and you can successfully generalize that information. So Gibson talked a lot about affordances. They're both objective and subjective properties of an object. And this is, it's sort of a unique way to look at generalization in training and intelligence. So if you have an agent that needs to generalize something, or some pattern in the environment, if it's an action type of a pattern, like if a robot is trying to move a door or throw a ball or do something with something, it needs to actually go through the action, try out different things, and have build this intuition of what this sort of thing does, and then it can um, apply that more broadly to other classes of similar thing. And that's how it actually would learn. It's not going to learn from presenting all possible options as to how this thing is used, because first of all, it can't necessarily select from those options. And secondly, um, you can't really test those out in the environment that you're in. It's going to be very hard to do that. So this is why a lot of robots have problems with tasks that seem effortless to us, because we've sort of automated. We have these sort of automated or procedural behaviors that we don't think about how we execute it. We just kind of learn the sort of the procedure, and we internalize that. Okay, so fourth, psychology is about the organism environment system. So we have to have the system of both the organism and the environment. This is this extended cognition where things are offloaded to the environment, where things are, we extend our cognition into the environment. And we use the environment and our mental models interchangeably. Okay, so this just kind of goes through this history and talks about sort of situatedness. And then it sets up as neuroecological cognitive architecture. So this is the neuroecological nexus theory. And so next is appropriate for the investigation of cognizing organism environment systems that have nervous systems. Since cognitive systems are always situated, next is committed to the position that such systems necessarily include organisms, which are embodied, of course, that are tightly coupled with or constituted by their ecologies. That's embeddedness. So, you have organisms that have a body, but they're tightly embedded in these ecologies or these environments. The nexus part refers to both the framework as a point of convergence for ecological psychology and neuroscience, and as a nexus that constitutes the primary causal and or constitutive links or junctions that connect the various elements of a cognizing organism environment system. So next is defined by 5 hypotheses. Hypothesis 1 is that the organism environment system is the privileged spatiotemporal scale to understand cognition. So we don't care about like the details of the brain, we care about the organism and the environment. But we also care about this multi-scale nature of the problem. So sometimes we want to drill down to neuronal activity and we want to have this information, but we want to link ecological psychology in the environment with neuronal activity in the brain. And so we need to establish this sort of organism environment system, but then have the access to these more detailed scales in the brain. Hypothesis 2 is that neural population dynamics generate the relevant states for cognizing. So this is where we have these population dynamics that are at a lower level of organization. And so we, instead of sort of thinking about cells as just neurons, we need to think about neural populations. And so a lot of times in cognition, neural populations are the things, the scale of interest, where neurons work together to produce representations, and their activity will, tune those representations accordingly. So there's a lot of theory and experiment behind that. A neuropopulation is a neuronal group that has been selected for over species development timescales. So you have specific populations of cells in the visual cortex that are tuned to extract things like columns, stripes, blobs, and then that feeds into higher level representations of images. You also have populations in sensory motor cortex that are tuned to different limb movements, directions of limb movements, things like that. Hypothesis 3 is that cognizing is based on low-dimensional neural dynamics. So this is where this manifold comes in, and manifolds are sort of the current theory of how neuronal signals are organized. The thinking is that there's this topology, or this representation that forms a topology. So you have these high-dimensional structures and low-dimensional manifolds, and so there's a mapping between the two that's what we call homeomorphic, which means that they share the same structure even though they look very different. So that's kind of a tool we can use to understand representations of, large conceptual spaces in low-dimensional structures. All right, and then of course it gets into a lot of things about the neural manifold hypothesis and how things that, say, this rat is interacting with the environment, moving around the environment, are represented in the brain as these neural manifolds, and then this was represented by a topological structure, like a torus. And so you would have like these movements and these interactions encoded as the shape, and then you explore that area of the shape through neuronal activity, and everything kind of maps to this torus, which is the representation of the environment. Yeah, so then this is a hypothesis 4 is that the body organizes into low-dimensional synergies. So this is going back to synergetics from Kelso, which is where you have limbs that sort of are controlled together into groups, muscles that are controlled together into these synergetic groups. And these groups then act as sort of, outputs for the neural manifolds. So a lot of times you can take a space and decompose it into a manifold itself. So there's this uncontrolled or unconstrained manifold hypothesis that basically breaks the environment down into a configuration space. If you have, like say, a workspace in front of you, like a desk, how do you have to move your limbs to reach every part of that space? And there actually are quite a few options if you were to consider every possible movement as an individual degree of freedom. But of course, our limbs don't operate like that. Our limbs operate as sort of these grouped muscle synergies, these grouped limb synergies. And so our limbs move in certain directions, and we have access to maybe a subset of movements to reach every part of that space. So when we move our arm, we don't, bend our wrist and bend our arm the other direction, or our elbow the other direction. We actually kind of, everything moves in a coordinated way so we can reach different parts of that space. And so there are a lot of different mathematical tools that allow us to decompose these spaces and suggest optimal placement of objects and things like that. And of course, this holds true for most things in the environment where, the brain actually computes sort of the most efficient path to a target. And it's a really interesting dynamical systems theory underlying this. And then hypothesis 5 is that cognizing fundamentally emerges at low dimensional states of the organism. And so next claims that cognizing is a multi-scale phenomena that emerges from systematic relationships among brain, body, and the world. So each spatiotemporal scale is high dimensional, but the principal structure of each is low dimensional. Okay, so this is something where, we're working from these neural populations, we're working from these uncontrolled manifolds that describe body synergies acting in the world, and then we can from there build a model of action in the world from neural populations. And so this is an example here of what a rodent in a burrow, and it's trying to navigate its way out of the burrow, and it's building this representation of the environment, and it's then acting upon it, and it's producing these muscle synergies that allow it to reach different points in the environment. And it has this model of an unconstrained manifold or an uncontrolled manifold that tell it kind of the best places to go for things. It's a nice paper because it stitches together a lot of ideas into what is essentially a cognitive architecture. There isn't a formal architecture program that he's producing here, but I think you can see the logic in a lot of this. Okay, so that's that paper. All right, so I think that's all for today. Thank you for attending,